Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Sacramento County's Public Budget Workshop. Thank you all for joining us today to learn more about the county's budget. I'm Amanda Thomas, the county's Chief Fiscal Officer, and I'll be providing an overview of the county's budget before we provide more information on 3 county departments that we're highlighting in today's workshop. I'm very happy to be joined today by Chris Wimsatt, the Deputy Director for Airport Finance and Administration, Timothy Lutz, the Director of Health Services, and Chad Rindy, the Director of Finance. Before we jump into the presentation, I did want to go over a few details for today's workshop. I wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed. For those attending live via Zoom, questions and comments can be submitted through the Zoom Q&A, and we plan to pause at the end of each presentation for questions. And Kim Nava, the county's Public Information Director, will be helping us with the Q&A this evening. Today's workshop is scheduled for 90 minutes, so we may not be able to get to every question, and we will follow up as necessary for any questions not addressed live. If you have more detailed questions or comments, we invite you to email budget@saccounty.gov. I will also be sharing that email address again later in the presentation, as well as other ways to get information or participate in the budget process. And finally, for those joining via Zoom, we will also be conducting some polls during the presentation and really encourage you to participate in those. So looking at the overview for today's workshop, I'm going to talk a little bit about some budget basics, and then talk a little bit more specifically about the county's budget and some of the sort of key concepts to understanding the county's budget, where our funding comes from and how we spend it. And then we'll go into the county department budget highlights. So as I mentioned, we'll be featuring Department of Airports, Department of Health Services with a focus on behavioral health services, as well as Department of Finance. So let us start off with our first poll question, just to get a sense for why you chose to participate today. So for this poll, you should be able to choose more than one answer, and please choose all that apply. And it looks like we've got some folks responding to the poll. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, so let's go ahead now and end the poll, and we can share the results. So it looks like we have kind of a good mix of responses here. So we have a few folks saying to learn more about the county budget, also interested in county services generally, not as many interested in a specific issue or program. And then there are some of you who are here for a reason that we did not guess. We'll be interested to know what that is and maybe ask a better poll question in the future. So let's go ahead and stop sharing that poll, and then I will go on to talking next about, in the next few slides, about some budget basics. So I'm going to really just talk about some really basic information that I think helps build a framework for understanding some of the foundation of the information that we'll be sharing on the county's budget. Okay, so what is a budget? At its most basic level, a budget is an annual spending plan reflecting all of the funding that's expected to be available during the year and setting forth a plan for how that funding will be spent. So that's really, I think, the most basic explanation of a budget. We're planning how we're going to spend our funding. For the county and other governments, the budget also provides legal authority to actually spend money and limits the amount that can be spent for specific purposes. And then finally, a budget can be used as a way to set policy direction, but it's probably more useful to view the budget as a policy implementation tool, where it can be used to implement policy decisions that have already been made. So one example, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later, is the county's process for developing budget priorities. So these are priorities that are adopted by the county's Board of Supervisors based on input from county residents, and then implemented in the budget that's recommended to and approved by the board. So moving on to talk a little bit about the legal and policy framework for the county's budget, which basically means the rules that we have to follow in preparing and administering the budget. The very first set of important rules is something called the County Budget Act. And that's a state law that defines how all county budgets are supposed, how all county budgets are supposed to be structured and how they're approved. And so when I said earlier that the budget provides the legal authority to spend money and limits how much can be spent, this law is where that comes from. And the rules and requirements for this are included in the state controller's budget guide. And then in addition to the County Budget Act and the State Controller's Budget Guide, there are many other state and federal laws, rules, and contract provisions that impact the county's budget, including rules for what certain types of funding can be spent on and whether we need to provide a certain amount of local funding. So these laws and rules are why we really only have discretion in spending a relatively small amount of local resources, which I'll talk more about later. And then in addition to the state and federal rules, the county has its own rules spelled out in the county charter and county code, including describing the responsibility of county officials in the budget process. And then finally, in addition to legal requirements, any board policy direction is reflected in the budget, including, again, as I mentioned, the board's budget priorities. So looking at some of the key terms and concepts that we use when we talk about the budget, I'll say that there are some somewhat technical terms listed here, and I'm trying not to get into too much detail, but I think it's important to have a basic understanding of these in order to understand the budget. So the first is appropriations, which is the term that we use for budgeted spending. And that's money that's paid for services, supplies, as well as county employee wages and benefits. And it also includes money that's transferred to other parts of the county. Then when we look at revenue, that's really the money that's coming into the county to pay for all of that spending. And revenue falls into three broad categories according to what it can be used for. So departmental revenue is revenue that can only be used for specific programs within each department. So this includes funding from the state and federal government, as well as fees that are collected by departments for specific services. Semi-discretionary revenue is money that the county receives from the state in the form of realignment revenue and public safety sales tax. And this revenue is restricted, so it can only be spent on certain categories, but the county has some discretion as to how to spend that money within those categories. And then finally, discretionary revenue is money that the county can use for any lawful purpose, and it primarily includes property tax and sales tax revenue. So net county cost is the term that we use in the budget to describe the appropriations that are funded with those discretionary resources. And you'll sometimes hear this referred to as general fund. In addition to revenue, appropriations can also be funded with fund balance, which is basically like the balance in the county's bank account. So once that money is spent, it isn't available to fund future year spending. And instead of spending that fund balance, that money can be set aside in reserves, sort of like a savings account, to be available when needed in future years. Okay, so that now that we've gone over some of those budget basics, we are going to dig a little bit more into the county's budget. But before we did that, I wanted to let you know that you can go to the Office of Budget and Debt Management website to access all of the resources I'll be talking about. So you can see the link to that website here, and I'll also be providing that later in the presentation. So when thinking about the county's budget, the county budget document is by far the most comprehensive source of information on the county's budget. And it includes all of the elements listed here under key sections, with 3 budgets published each year. But at over 1,000 pages, it might be a little bit too much information if what you're looking for is just a higher level understanding of the budget. And for that, I would recommend the Budget in Brief, which is also available on our website. It includes a lot of the information that I'm going to be going over in this presentation, and at just 7 pages, it's a much easier read than the full budget document. For anyone that would like a more interactive way to understand the county's budget, we also have a Budget Explorer tool on our website that allows you to drill into the budget to see the department and expenditure type detail in a more graphical format if you're really interested in kind of digging into and understanding those numbers a little bit better. All right, so that brings us to our next poll question. And the rest of these polls are sort of meant to test your knowledge. If you don't know the answer, just give it your best guess. So this first one is a true or false. The county has discretion, meaning we can choose how to spend most of the money in the budget. So looks like we got some folks responding. We'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and show those poll results. So it looks like most folks, about 2/3, got this right. False. About a third of you thought that that was true. And let's go ahead and stop sharing the results. And what I will show you is on the next slide here, it kind of gives you a graphical depiction of this. And this slide is showing that how the county's total overall appropriations, so our total spending for the current fiscal year, about $9.2 billion, how that's funded, broken down by those different types of funding sources that I talked about earlier. And you can see that the largest category is that departmental revenue category at about $5 billion. And again, this is the type of revenue that must be spent on specific programs in each department, right? So where we don't have discretion or choice about how the funding is spent, you can see that's by far the largest piece of this pie. And then you can see that the second largest category is actually another really big slice at $2 billion are the transfers, which is just that money that's moving around within the county. And then we get to the categories where the county has more choice or discretion over how the money is spent. And you can see that both semi-discretionary and discretionary sources represent about $1 billion each, so relatively small shares of the overall county budget. And then looking at the discretionary funding sources, you can see that property taxes represent the largest source at about $631 million. And I think Chad's going to talk about property taxes a little bit more detail in his presentation later. So turning now to this chart, which shows that same $9.2 billion, except this one is showing us, instead of where the money is coming from, how the money is being spent. So you can see about $2.3 billion is in non-operating and other budgets, and that roughly lines up with the transfers that we saw on the previous chart. Of the $6 billion, so the majority of this that's in operating budgets, you can see off to the right how that is distributed among the different functional areas within the county. So sort of think of that as the grouping of the different types of services that the county provides. And you can see that social services represents the largest share at $2.4 billion. And this includes one of the departments featured today, health services, as well as other departments such as child, family, and adult services, homeless services and housing, and human assistance. And then you can see that community services represents the next largest share at $1.8 billion. And that includes another department from this workshop, airports, as well as departments like transportation, regional parks, and waste management and recycling. Public safety and justice represents about $1.1 billion and includes departments such as sheriff, district attorney, probation, and public defender. And then the third department in today's workshop, finance, is categorized under support services, which also includes other internal administrative services departments like technology and personnel, and along with general government departments such as voter registration and elections and assessor, represent smaller shares of overall spending. These next charts show the same overall totals by functional area, with the size of each of these donuts reflecting the relative size of the budget. and shows how the funding for each breaks out in terms of the 3 categories that we talked about earlier. So you can see that the green departmental category is the largest category for every area except for public safety and justice. And in social services, this is largely state and federal funding, whereas in community services, this also includes fees and other revenues for many of the services provided by the county. So I did want to talk briefly about some of the key factors that impact the county's budget this year and as we look forward into future years. So the county receives one-time sources of funding for certain programs, including from the state and federal government, and also in some cases uses fund balance, which is another one-time source, to fund expenditures. One of the things that we have to consider with the use of one-time sources is the sustainability of programs that are funded with these sources, which really requires additional sources of funding to be identified in the future. And looking at the budget, the county also has to consider legal obligations, which must be funded. So one example that you may have heard of is the May's consent decree regarding the conditions in the county's jails, which has required substantial investments in recent years and will continue to require additional investments in future years, both to continue to improve jail conditions and also to continue to implement programs that are designed to reduce the jail population. The county has significant capital and maintenance needs, including hundreds of millions of dollars in road maintenance backlog alone. We are also, of course, impacted by what's going on in the economy generally. So inflation in recent years resulted in increased costs, as well as economic uncertainty as the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to bring inflation down, which negatively impacted the housing market and likely limited the growth in property tax revenues, which again are the county's main source of discretionary funding. And then finally, because many of those in the community who rely on the social and other services provided by the county need those services the most during economic downturns, it's really important for the county to try to maintain those services to the maximum extent possible. And one of the ways that we can do that is by trying to build our reserves to a level where we are able to weather an economic storm and maintain those service levels to the community. So this chart is a good illustration of that and shows what happened to the county's tax revenue during the Great Recession, and that we would have needed at that time about $600 million in reserves to continue funding at the same level as we experienced a reduction in revenues due to the economic recession. And of course, today that number would be even higher. So we've made some progress in recent years, including funding a service stability reserve. We still have a ways to go, and it will be important for us to continue building reserves to the extent feasible. So I mentioned the budget priorities earlier, and I wanted to share some of the process that supported development of those priorities leading up to this year's budget, which actually started back in mid-2021 with input from the county's advisory boards and commissions, then formed a public opinion survey of county residents in the fall of 2021. And then we followed up with focus groups of county residents in the fall of 2022, which reinforced the results of that initial survey. And so based on the results of the survey, the board adopted budget priorities in December 2021, and then reaffirmed those priorities actually twice, most recently in December of last year after conducting a follow-up survey that fall. So I'll show you what those priorities are on the next slide, but I also wanted to let you know that we're now in the process of potentially refining or reaffirming those priorities for the upcoming fiscal year budget, which is the 2025-26 budget. And that process included conducting follow-up focus groups of county residents last month. So the analysis of those focus groups and recommendations for the 25-26 budget priorities are expected to be presented to the Board of Supervisors next month on January 7th. So the current budget priorities for this current fiscal year 24-25 are shown here, and they really echo a lot of the themes that we have already talked about. They're number one, of course, complying with our obligations, so our legal, financial, regulatory, and policy obligations. Number two, optimizing the use of county resources with budgeted service levels for county programs that are informed by the community's priorities. And number three, funding new or enhanced programs that focus on the most critical and urgent needs as identified by the community surveys and focus groups. So those we've identified as a county-wide focus area of addressing homelessness, its impacts and contributing factors, including the cost and availability of housing, mental health services, and substance use treatment. And then an unincorporated focus area of improving the condition of roads in the county. All right, so that brings us to our third polling question, which is, and again, this just give your best guess. We're going to start talking about the county's budget process. So for our fiscal year that begins July 1st, when are budget requests submitted for that fiscal year? So your choices are February, April, June, or September of the prior year. I see we've got some folks responding. Got some good guesses in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. And most of you got this one right. So February is actually the right answer for most departments, although I will say some internal service departments start earlier. So those of you who guessed September may have been thinking that. But yeah, I think it's surprising to some folks that that's really how early we start the budget process and start thinking and planning for that upcoming year as departments are really identifying those needs leading up to February and submitting those requests in February. So let's go ahead and stop sharing. And I will show you a little bit more what that full budget process looks like. So the next several slides really do show all of that detail, and I'm not going to go into all of the details, but I did want to point out some of the key dates and really highlight that the blue boxes on the bottom here are showing planned public meetings and opportunities to participate in the county's budget process, whereas the top is really showing more of our internal budget process. So you can see, looking at the blue boxes, obviously we have today, December 12th, our public budget workshop. I mentioned January 7th, where we anticipate the analysis of the budget priority focus groups and the recommended budget priorities. Will be at the Board of Supervisors meeting on that date. And then just looking up at the top in terms of budget process, you can see that we have started that process for internal services departments already this year. And in February, you see their requested budgets due for the fiscal year 25-26. I will mention on the bottom here, we do anticipate in March at a Board of Supervisors meeting in March, giving a mid-year fiscal review. So that's sort of a check-in in terms of where we are in the current fiscal year compared to budget. And then as we move forward in the budget calendar, you can see that recommended budget for fiscal year 25-26 will be released at the end of May, and that is in preparation for recommended budget hearings June 4th through 6th, again at the Board of Supervisors. And that recommended budget is what's approved before the fiscal year begins July 1st. And then what happens is that after the current fiscal year closes and after the state approves its budget, we have some more information available to us that we didn't have when the recommended budget was developed. So we use that additional information to develop a revised recommended budget, and that gets released at the end of August in preparation for revised recommended budget hearings in September. So next year, that will be September 3rd through 5th. And then finally, after that revised recommended budget hearing, we developed an adopted budget that's formally adopted by the board at the end of September. So that is showing you the full budget process and some of the opportunities to get involved in the public meetings. And then in addition to participating in those upcoming public meetings, here are some other ways to get involved or just to learn more about the budget. So for one thing, I wanted to let you all know that this recorded presentation will be available on the county's YouTube page. You can submit questions and comments by email at any time to budget@saccounty.gov. You can view budget documents and use that Budget Explorer tool that I showed you on the Office of Budget and Debt Management webpage. You could apply to serve on a county advisory board, write, email, or phone your county supervisor, and sign up to receive information about the county's budget. And we will show this slide again at the end of the presentation, and this PowerPoint will also be posted to our website where you can access the links at any time. And I really like to thank everyone for their interest, and do want to pause now to see if there are any questions that I can address from the Q&A.
No pending questions, Amanda.
All right, well, thank you, Kim. So with that then, I am happy to turn it over to Chris Wimsett from the county's Department of Airports.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Thanks for the great information. So welcome everybody. As Amanda said, my name is Chris Wimsett. I'm the Deputy Director for Finance and Administration for the Department of Airports. So I want to take a little bit of time today to talk about the Department of Airports budget, but also kind of what the broader context for the airport budget is, and where we get our revenue from and what we spend our money on. So just to get everybody kind of centered on what the Sacramento County Department of Airports is, we own and or operate 4 airports in Sacramento County, starting at the top left with SMF, or Sacramento International Airport. This is a medium hub commercial service airport serving about 13 million passengers annually. Opened in 1967, consists of 2 terminals, about 18,100 parking spaces, and we've got several airlines that I'll show in just a second. The next airport that we also own is Mather Airport. That's the former Mather Air Force Base. And this is a national reliever airport that we inherited from the Air Force in 1995. This is a general aviation as well as cargo airport south of Rancho Cordova. Next on the list is Sacramento Executive Airport. This airport is actually owned by the city of Sacramento, but leased by the county and operated by the Department of Airports. Prior to the opening of Sacramento International Airport in 1967, Sacramento Executive Airport was actually the commercial service airport serving the city, which is why it got the city call sign, SAC, SAC. And then finally there in the South County, we have Franklin Field, which is a small general aviation airport serving mostly training and agricultural uses, like I said, there in the South County. So Sacramento International Airport is certainly the largest airport and the airport responsible for the most revenue and the most expenses within the airport system. So we serve a constituency that is broader than the county itself. We actually serve a 7-county region that stretches all the way from Redding in the north down to Merced in the south, from the kind of the outskirts of the Lake Tahoe area in the east to the East Bay in the west. And this service area encompasses over 3 million people. And this is the primary area that we draw those more than 13 million passengers from that I mentioned a second ago. And so when I talk about serving passengers, what we're really talking about are providing air service. We provide flights. So as of July of this year, there were 12 scheduled passenger airlines offering 176 daily flights to 42 nonstop destinations. That includes service to 3 different countries, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And the airlines providing that service are provided here. We can see that Southwest Airlines is by far the largest carrier out of Sacramento International, and it operates most of Concourse B. And then the other 3 legacy air carriers, Delta, American, and United, operate about an equal number of the market share here, followed by some of our lower cost carriers. In total, over 63% of our Sacramento International Airport passengers flew on low cost carriers last year. And so our air service is increasing, and as our air service increases, our passenger load increases as well, which is requiring a lot of expansion, which we'll talk about here in a few slides when we talk about some of the construction going on. Now, one of the things about the airport system that's unique is that we're an airport, we're a county-owned department, and most of our airports are owned by the county, but we have a governance structure as an enterprise fund where we are entirely self-supporting. So none of our operating funds are paid for with local tax dollars. We do receive some federal tax dollars for capital purposes and to build certain capital improvements, but the only form of tax dollars that we receive are those federal dollars. The rest of our revenue comes from fees that are charged to users of the airport and to our tenants. We do pay the county for some shared services, and we receive those shared services. And ultimately, in our grant assurances, which are the rules that determine how we use the funds that we generate, those grant assurances are regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. There are very stringent rules defining what we are and are not allowed to pay local governments. So with that, I'll get to the next poll question. I just mentioned it, but can anybody remember what the airline serving the most passengers at Sacramento International Airport is? Was it Delta, United, Alaska, or Southwest? Give folks a few seconds to answer. Okay, and we have 100% correct answers. Great. Good to see everyone was paying attention. I appreciate that. So next, I mentioned we were going to talk a little bit about what the sources of revenue are for the airport system. As folks would, I think, probably intuit, airline revenues are a pretty significant source of revenue. So the airlines pay the airport system for use of the facilities at Sacramento International Airport. And those facilities include our terminals, and they pay us rents for use of that terminal space. They also pay us landing fees and other rental and fees for use of our airfield facilities. That includes our runways and our ramp space. And so the airline revenues, in terms of the source, represent the single largest source of revenue, but it's not the largest category of revenue. Our largest category of revenue is non-airline revenue. And our largest source of non-airline revenue, the category, is actually parking. So I mentioned earlier that we have about 18,100 parking spaces at Sacramento International Airport. Those 18,100 parking spaces generated about $75 million in revenue last fiscal year. Our next largest source of non-airline revenue are rental car concession fees. And this is a percentage of the gross revenue that rental car concession providers at Sacramento International Airport charge. They pay to the airport system in rent. It's a similar structure for terminal concessions. And we've also got some revenue from ground transportation and from building and ground leases. And those building and ground leases, those revenues are collected across the airport system at all 4 of our airports. The next source of revenue are non-operating revenues, and these are pretty specific, and all of the revenue collected in this category has some pretty specific uses. So the first on the list we see is PFC. PFC is short for the passenger facility charge, and the passenger facility charge is levied on passengers when they book a ticket. So the next time you book an airline ticket, you can look at that ticket and see that you'll be charged a passenger facility charge. And the amount that is charged is regulated in federal law, and it is distributed among the different airports that you'll visit during your trip. So if you've got a layover, then that passenger facility charge will be distributed between the 3 airports that you hit. These charges are allowed to be spent specifically on passenger facilities, and ultimately all uses of passenger facility charge revenue need to be applied for and approved by the Federal Aviation Administration prior to being spent. The CFC is the customer facility charge. This is a charge that's levied on rental car transactions, and this is governed by state law. We're allowed to use this source of revenue to build and improve rental car facilities at any of our airports, but in our case at Sacramento International Airport. We also have federal grants that provide a portion of funding for our capital program and some of our large construction. The largest source of federal grants is the Airport Improvement Program, or AIP grants. And these grants are provided from the Airport Airways Trust Fund, which is paid for by excise taxes on fuel and tickets. And then we also receive interest income on cash that we have sitting basically as fund balance. So now one thing you'll notice a discrepancy here, and I'll point it out again in a second. The total FY 2025 budget in terms of revenue is about $320 million. When I flip to the next side and we show expenses, we see expenses far above $320 million. That's set. The total expenses here is $796 million. The source of that discrepancy is on our previous slide. We can see down here in the footnotes below the total budget number, that revenue does not include a 2024 bond issuance of $469 million. And so the difference here is really explained by an increase in capital costs. And these are associated with our SMF Ford capital construction program, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. But in terms of cost categories, our largest cost category on this chart are these capital costs. And these are costs for large scale assets that have an extended useful life. And we typically spread these costs out over multiple years, either by bonding out the costs of the project or by amortizing the project and charging them to the airlines over a number of years. The next category of costs is going to be our operating costs. So this includes our personnel costs, our contracts, materials costs. Next in line would be depreciation and amortization. I mentioned those are those are some of the tools we use to spread high costs over an extended period of time. Ultimately, the revenue that we charge to the airlines is how we recoup a significant portion of our costs. And so by depreciating and amortizing these costs, we can spread out the length of time that we charge these expenses to the airlines. Ultimately, we also have an annual debt service in fiscal year 2025 of $46 million. The $469 million bond issuance that we did in calendar year 2024 will actually increase our debt service costs. But you can think of debt service costs as being basically the annual cost of our mortgage. This is the amount that we pay in return for the debt that we owe for the construction of the facilities that we've built. We also have about $15.4 million in repair and maintenance expenses and about $4 million in equipment and capital outlay costs. So I mentioned earlier construction, and I often get the question, what's all the construction going on at Sacramento International Airport? This is all related to our SMF Ford capital program. The SMF Ford capital program is a $1.3 billion construction campaign to increase the size of and to improve our passenger amenities at Sacramento International Airport. So I'll briefly describe each of these projects, starting with the bottom left project on the overhead map there that shows additional gates for Concourse B. Plan here is to provide 6 additional gates at Concourse B to expand our availability of gates for additional air service. Above that project, we see the pedestrian walkway. Anybody who's been to Sacramento International and flown out of Concourse B knows that we've got those trains that connect Terminal B to Concourse B. And this pedestrian walkway will be an additional method of transit between Terminal B and Concourse B, and it will provide the opportunity for passengers to walk between the two. Underneath the pedestrian walkway is a light blue highlighted project there shown as the new Terminal A exit roadway. All of these projects that we're doing are going to require that we change the way traffic flows through our airport. And so ultimately that requires removing traffic from the center plaza between the Terminal A parking garage and Terminal B, and routing everything around to the west side, which is facing downward here on this map, around the west side of Terminal B. Immediately to the right of the Terminal A exit roadway is the Terminal B parking garage. This is a project that's currently under construction to build 5,500 new parking spaces immediately to the west of Terminal B. Above the parking garage is a new ground transportation center, which will consolidate all Ubers, Lyfts, shuttles, and taxis into the center plaza where you currently exit either Terminal A or Terminal B. And it'll be walkable and accessible from both terminals. And then finally, the last chronological piece of the SMF Ford capital program is the consolidated rental car facility, which will build a new large walkable consolidated rental car facility immediately to the south of the Terminal A parking garage, and will move all of the rental car operations currently from where they are further to the south of that, which will eliminate the need for shuttle busing, which we're very excited about. As I said, in total, the costs for this program are about $1.3 billion. These are some renderings of the pedestrian walkway, which is currently under construction. The pedestrian walkway consists of two bridges connected by a vertical circulation hub. Inside that vertical circulation hub are elevators and escalators that'll help folks get from the third floor level of Terminal B, where they will enter the walkway, to the second floor of Concourse B level, where they will exit the walkway. And to the right of the exterior picture are some internal renderings that show what that might look like when it's done. And with that, I'll get to the next poll question. What percent of the airport budget is funded by your property taxes? I'll give everybody a second to answer that. Again, I mentioned that a few seconds ago. See if folks remember how much in local tax dollars are used to fund airport operations. Okay, most folks got it right, 0%. There are no local tax dollars used in the operation of your airport. But here are the funds that are used in the operation and specifically in the capital improvements associated with the airport. So I did mention that we get some grants from the Federal Aviation Administration. Most of those come in the form of either an Airport Improvement Program grant, AIP grant, or there was money made available in the bipartisan infrastructure law signed in 2021. That's also made available, and that's being put to good use on several projects related to SMF Ford. There's also some funding available from the Transportation Security Administration. There are occasionally state and local government grants. We were able to use state grants on the extension of Elkhorn Boulevard onto airport property, and we were certainly thankful for those funds. I mentioned also that the passenger facility charge, or PFCs, this is a federally regulated source of funds, but it's all generated locally on airport. Customer facility charge is a state-regulated source of funds, but it is also generated locally on airport. And then for the most part, the remainder are funded with airport revenue bonds. And these are bonds funded by a combination of airline and non-airline revenues, and are used to fund the difference between the total project costs and what the other sources will fund. On occasion, special facility bonds and tenant financed improvements can be done to build specific projects on a project finance basis. And then airport equity or airport cash reserves can be used to fund some projects. And on occasion, we can do a public-private partnership and make use of some private investments to fund airport infrastructure. So this is a list of airport acronyms. I'm not going to go through these. What I will do, though, is open it up for questions and ask Kim, are there any questions in the Q&A?
No pending questions, Chris.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kim. Well, with that, thanks everybody for their time, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim Lutz, who's the Director of the County Department of Health Services.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for your interest and participation in county budget process. I'm the Director of Health Services, and I'm going to talk today about one of the programs within Department of Health Services, behavioral health services. Certainly something that I'm sure a number of you have heard about in the news over the last few years, just in terms of the amount of changes that the programs have been undergoing, new initiatives, new funding, voter and state legislature approved initiatives. So lots of interest in kind of the funding of behavioral health. And so I'll try and go through this as quickly as I can. I could probably spend the whole presentation on a couple of these topics alone, just recognizing the complexity of behavioral health. So first of all, the behavioral health program provides services, which is specialty mental health services for those with the most severe mental health challenges, adults, and then youth with serious mental disturbance. Where the most serious mental illness comes into play versus more mild to moderate cases of mental illness, our managed care plan partners typically provide services for lower level mental health, less severe mental health disorders. And our program primarily serves the Medi-Cal population. However, there are a number of key programs within behavioral health that will serve anybody. And we'll kind of talk about some of those different programs as I move along through the presentation. Our annual budget this last year, $724.8 million, and that funds 661 positions. And importantly, most of the work we do, about 90% of the actual direct service that we do is through contract. So we have a really extensive provider network, 161 provider agencies, over 238 programs. So when you factor all of those programs in, we're funding well over 3,500 positions across Sacramento County. Very high level client statistics summary. Last year we served 34,035 consumers. And when you look at our prevention, early intervention programs that are broadly targeted, outreach, engagement, marketing, we reached 400,000 through those programs. So this next slide talks specifically about where behavioral health gets its money. And you can see from these funding components, 39% of our revenue is from the federal government through Medi-Cal billing. Now, when we refer to that, it's actually called patient care revenue. And basically what that means for us is when it comes back after we've submitted invoices to the federal government, receive money back for valid expenditures, it comes back as a patient care revenue or PCR. As I go through this presentation, you might hear me referring to either of those. Know that that means federal funds that we're using to operate our programs. Just under a quarter of behavioral health funding comes from 1991 and 2011 realignment. During her presentation, Amanda talked a lot about or at least realignment, different types of funding, discretionary, semi-discretionary. Realignment funds are derived from sales tax and vehicle license fees, and that's what provides the funding for counties. In both 1991 and 2011, conveniently enough, based on the name, that's when these responsibilities for certain programs were realigned or moved from the state of California to counties to administer those programs. And then finally, 20% of our funding comes from the Mental Health Services Act, or MHSA. Important to note, as a result of voter-approved Proposition 1, this pot of funding will be changing somewhat in terms of what types of services it'll fund. Most notably, it'll fund much more services for unsheltered homeless. But then also, we're going to start to see some more substance use services braided into this program. So it'll be referred to as then the Behavioral Health Services Act, or BHSA, to reflect that it is now encompassing both mental health treatment and also substance use treatment services. So first poll question for everybody is, what percentage of behavioral health revenue comes from federal sources? 12%, 55%, 39%, or 70%? And we'll pause for a second, let people have time to respond. All right, looks like most of you guys were paying attention. At 39% is the correct answer. That's how much we get in Medi-Cal or PCR funding for behavioral health. So switching now to an overview of talking about what revenue we get. Now we're talking about where those expenditures are, what programs that revenue funds. So this shows you a breakdown. You can see adult mental health is the largest component of the behavioral health program. About 32% of behavioral health services, followed by child and family mental health services at about 23%. Those two combined make up more than half of the behavioral health program. And then substance use prevention treatment is about 15%. And then treatment beds, 16%, in addition to our mental health treatment center. I'll talk a little more depth on each of these components in the next few minutes. Quickly on administration. So administrative costs represent about $62 million in the behavioral health budget. That's 8.5% of the total budget, which is pretty reasonable. We're allowed to claim up to 15%. In our case, we've tried to maintain as much costs out to our providers and direct services. So we've been at 8.5%. These positions are critical given how much we contract out. They're doing contract monitoring, technical assistance, help with billing, and billing itself to be able to draw down revenues. And now I'll focus more now on our service-based programs with these initial slides talking about some of our outpatient programs and services, and then we'll get into treatment beds. So our adult mental health services represents approximately $229 million of the budget. We served 18,330 consumers through this program. And really the front door, the critical access point for our adult mental health system are our community outreach, recovery, and empowerment, or CORE programs. These are 11 community-based outpatient treatment centers that not only contain outpatient mental health clinic, but a peer operated, and by peer, I mean someone with lived experience, mental health, lived experience, substance use, homelessness. So it's peer operated walk-in clinic or walk-in wellness center. So a welcoming place where people can come in, participate in groups, get connected with resources, and have a sense of community connectedness. These core centers then are designed to really be a key front door to then allow somebody who's engaging in treatment to step up to higher level needs if it's a full service partnership or FSP, or if it's a residential program. Other key areas that we do serve our adult population with is that aforementioned full service partnerships. We have 12 full service partnership programs within the adult system. And these, you'll probably have heard this in the news a few times. And full service partnerships, or FSPs, really represent a whatever it takes approach. There's not a one size fits all way to provide these services. They're tailored to the individual's needs, but they're designed to help people with the most intense, highest level of need. It can include housing, job training, rental assistance, any types of services to help them be successful on their road to recovery. I'll talk a little bit about our crisis network or our crisis continuum in a little bit, but I will highlight here within our adult mental health service system, we have our mental health urgent care, crisis stabilization, and crisis residential programs, mobile crisis support teams, and our justice involved population or programs, which we call the Thrive programs, where we have an outpatient, a couple outpatient clinics and a new FSP expansion or in programs to serve this group. So this brings up to our next poll question. How many adult outpatient core centers does behavioral health have in Sacramento County? Give everyone a couple minutes or a couple seconds to respond. Looking at the results, looks like most of you, 62%, were paying attention to 11. Yes, so we have 11 core centers, or our adult outpatient system of care core centers outstationed throughout our Sacramento communities. Shifting now to our youth, child and family mental health services. This represents approximately $169 million of our budget, and we served a little over 9,000 clients in this program last year. Similar to our adults and core program, our primary outpatient program for our youth is the flexible integrated treatment or FIT program. These are 16 sites that are operated by 10 different provider agencies. And again, with the similar mission of being able to be a front door for youth and families in need of services for youth that can provide scalability to step up into higher level services or step down into ongoing treatment services. Our children and family mental health program works very closely with both our sister department, Department of Child, Family, and Adults, and the Child Welfare Program, and also the Probation Department for youth involved in both of their programs. Some of those types of services that we work on with them are wraparound programs. These are high-intensity programs that wrap services in a similar way to what some of our full-service partnerships do around those youth and their family. And then our juvenile justice diversion and treatment program, group homes and short-term residential treatment programs targeted toward our child welfare involved youth. We also do have a transitional age youth, and typically when we say transitional age, we're talking about ages 16 to 25. We have a full service partnership program for those transitional age youth as well. And then talking about our substance use prevention and treatment, or SUPTE program, it's approximately $106 million of the budget, served a little over 6,000 clients last year. And in this program has really gone through extensive change since 2019, when the county implemented the drug Medi-Cal organized delivery system. That's quite a mouthful, often referred to as DMCOs. And this program allowed us to bring in additional funding, both on the federal side and state side, to really increase the array of services offered within the substance use treatment program. It allowed for case management, residential treatment services, recovery services, detox and withdrawal management, and prevention services. Important to note, as these services has expanded, and we know that's been widely discussed, ongoing challenges and the higher levels of substance use disorders, we know building out residential treatment is a critical area that we've been needing to focus on it and have been. In the next 3 years, we have nearly 200 beds that will be coming online to really try and address any wait times or delays in people going into substance use treatment when they're ready for treatment. So stepping back a bit from some of our outpatient focused programs and talking about our crisis continuum, our crisis continuum really is a critical safety net that is ensuring that when someone is in immediate mental health or substance use crisis, we have places for them to go and we can link them to the right level of treatment. We have 4 large standalone psychiatric hospitals within our county, and the county also operates our own treatment center, the Mental Health Treatment Center. Important to note that we actually cannot use federal funds for those large standalone hospitals and the Mental Health Treatment Center due to something called the Institution for Mental Disease, or IMD, exclusion. What that means is we can't bill for those services if the facility is larger than 16 beds. We hope there is a waiver working its way through the federal government that the county is ready to implement that might open up additional funding in some of those cases. But for the time being, that's something that we continually keep in mind, and it means those services use dollars a lot faster because we can't draw down federal match to provide those services. Recognizing that, we have 3 16-bed county dedicated psychiatric health facilities that are able to bill Medi-Cal and that we continue to utilize extensively. Our front door for crisis often is mental health urgent care, which right now we have one of. Our hope is to continue to expand those urgent cares. That's a spot for people to come in when they're in crisis, get linked to a provider, get linked for medication, and or get linked to one of our treatment programs. Our crisis receiving behavioral health program focuses on substance use primarily and is another front door for those in crisis. And then our community wellness response team that's launched over the last 1.5 years is field-based non-law enforcement response to someone in immediate mental health crisis. So instead of calling 911, they can call 988. If our team needs to be dispatched into the community, they will go out and help stabilize somebody or get them linked into treatment services. So talking a little bit more about treatment beds, inpatient treatment, so we refer to inpatient treatment either acute or subacute. Acute is where you're looking at your psychiatric health facilities. Subacute is where someone starts to either step down into a lower level of service need or are going to be in a longer term placement until they're more easily stabilized. We serve within this program, these are all contracted beds that we're talking about here, served 3,061 clients last year, and the cost is about $115 million. This includes placement to state hospital, freestanding psychiatric hospitals, mental health rehabilitation centers, skilled nursing facilities, and adult residential treatment. Recognizing there are shortages in the mental health rehabilitation centers, the county's partnered with one of our community-based organizations to build out a 32-bed mental health rehabilitation center that should be coming online in the next 3 years as well. In addition to contracted treatment beds, the county does operate our own facility called the Mental Health Treatment Center. This is a psychiatric health facility and also something that's called an intake stabilization unit, place for somebody to go in crisis, get stabilized, and then decide, are they going to be staying at the treatment center for a while or are they going to go somewhere else? This is a 50-bed facility, and we receive drop-ins from law enforcement currently. Important for this facility, and new in January of 2025, is we will also start to receive drop-offs from EMS ambulances for our new triage to alternate destination program. This helps keep people out of the EDs, and really someone in a mental health crisis, a much more appropriate place to go than an emergency room. And then also the Mental Health Treatment Center will be receiving law enforcement drop-offs under the SB 43 program that expands when someone can be placed under a 5150, which historically has always been based on a mental health disorder, to also include a substance use disorder. So last poll question for me is, what is the federal regulation that restricts being able to bill the federal government for a portion of psychiatric treatment beds in facilities larger than 16 beds? Federal waiver rule, IMD exclusion rule, treatment bed rule, treatment waiver rule. Give everybody a couple seconds to respond. All right, nice. 82% got it right, the IMD exclusion rule. Thank you. All right, almost done, but before I wrap up, I do want to highlight another area that behavioral health has invested significantly in over the last 6 years, and that's in our services to homeless individuals. Now, when I talked about our adult outpatient or our youth outpatient, want to recognize that we serve a lot of those that are either unsheltered or at risk of becoming homeless. So that's in addition to these direct investments that we've made to try and serve those that are homeless. So we've certainly increased investments in things like housing. So actually paying for permanent supportive housing units for our behavioral health consumers. We also offer flexible housing supports, help with rent, help with a down payment, move-in expenses, on-site housing case management. So when we have our clients in housing units, we'll provide on-site case management to help support them, make sure that they are keeping on the road to recovery, and helping them if they start to fall into crisis. And then this also includes our field-based outreach team, which is our Homeless Engagement and Response Team, or HEART. This is a group that's going into encampments, linking people to services, developing rapport, and really helping serve those that are on the streets and homeless. So you can see over the last 6 years, 2019-20, our budget was about $28 million in investments. Looking fiscal year 24-25, 88,539 that we've invested in our behavioral health homeless programs. Then I'll close this. I won't read through all of these, but just highlight the fact that behavioral health is in the news a lot, and we're in the news. I feel at a great opportunity for behavioral health to really transform our system, but it is a lot. The last year and a half, we really started to see an influx post-pandemic of increases in different initiatives. Then we're going to continue to see that through July of 2026, which is when Proposition 1 and that Behavioral Health Services Act kicks in. So I thank everybody for listening. I'll pause here to see if there are any questions.
No pending questions, Tim.
All right, thank you. Then I will turn it over to Chad Rindy and Department of Finance.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Chad Rindy, as Tim mentioned, Director of the Department of Finance, and I'm excited to give you a brief overview of my department this evening. And so first I want to share off with the mission of Department of Finance. And so we serve critical countywide functions that support both departments and agencies to efficiently collect and to effectively use resources that deliver responsive services and transparency to the public. And our finance functions generally fall into three different categories. We perform accounting, financial reporting, and we perform auditing. We do a variety of collection activities, and we disperse those funds out. And then we perform the custody and the investment of funds. And so our department is separate from Amanda's team, who led out this presentation this evening, who really focus on the budgeting of funds, looking forward with the county's finances, as well as managing the county's debt. As we move on to the next slide, our team in the Department of Finance, we have 248 staff. We do presently have 2 locations, one here downtown, and we have one out at Mather off of Armstrong Avenue. Our department is separated into 7 different divisions. We have an administrative division, we have an auditor controller division, the consolidated utility billing and services division, investments, revenue recovery, tax collection, and business licensing, and treasury. And I'll talk a little bit more about those activities, but it kind of gives you a sense of the broad variety of financial activities that we undertake within the Department of Finance. So looking forward at our budget overall is about 55 million. And we fall in that category, as Amanda mentioned, as a support services department, as really our role is to support other departments in being successful through their activities. And so that's the reason why you see the largest part of our budget is generated by charges for services. About 60% of our activities are charging back to those customer department and agencies to provide the revenues for our programs. The second largest activity is our fines and penalties, and that's generated for some of our collection programs when customers do not pay timely. Unfortunately, they incur fines and penalties and interest on those payments that then are used as a resource to sustain a variety of our programs. And then the next largest category is our license and permits. And that ties directly back to the business licensing function, which is a compliance function wherein business owners, as they pay their permit fees, those are provided to us to sustain the program on our end. And a small part of our budget is general fund, or what was referenced earlier as net county cost, about 5% that supports the Department of Finance. On the right, you can see amongst our divisions, our budget is spread out relatively evenly between the various divisions, with our auditor controller division being the largest division at about 26% of our budget. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the functions that we perform. And through our Treasury Investment Division, we're responsible for managing and investing approximately $7 billion of pooled funds. By law, the funds of the county are required to be invested through us, as well as the funds of all of the K through 12 school districts that reside within the county, a variety of special districts, which include fire districts, community services districts, and others that are required to keep their funds on deposit with us. And our goal in the management of the investment of these funds is to make sure that we keep those funds safe, so we're not losing money as we operate our investment program. We keep those funds liquid enough to be able to pay the bills and expenses of not only the county, but the other agencies that have entrusted us with their funds. And then finally, to earn yield or interest on those funds. And so this last quarter, our pool was earning approximately 4.6% interest on the investment of funds after meeting those other objectives. Given the fact that we invest funds of a variety of local government agencies, we do have a Treasury Oversight Committee. that contains members of these agencies as well as members of the public that oversee our investment activities quarterly to make sure that we're making sound investment choices as well as ensuring compliance with all of the laws and regulations that exist. Next, I want to talk about our Auditor Controller Division. And our Auditor Controller Division provides support to our county departments, a variety of special districts, and other agencies. It does that through maintaining the accounting of their books and records, as well as processing a variety of payments out to employees, out to vendors, out to retirees from the Sacramento County retirement system, and making payments out via public assistance to those that are receiving financial assistance and benefits from the county. The county processes approximately 230 payments, 230,000 payments per year out to this group overall. The Auditor Controller Division also is responsible for performing our financial reporting activities, including the issuing of our annual comprehensive financial report. That report issued annually is independently audited and shows the financial and operational results of the county for the previous year. Those reports are posted on our website, with the latest report being for our fiscal year that recently ended on June 30, 2024, being posted just this last week. We also perform the internal audit function for the county, wherein we look for operational performance, we audit for compliance, and we also investigate when there are whistleblower complaints of possible wrongful acts that require investigation. And then finally, within our Auditor Controller Division, we have a Tax Accounting Services Division that is responsible for a variety of activities related to our property taxes. And I just want to talk through property taxes briefly with you all tonight because it involves various different parts of the county to ensure that the property tax process is completed. Property taxes all start with the county assessor, which is a separate department from the County of Finance. And the assessor's role is when there is a change in property ownership, they take the responsibility of valuing that taxable property, coming up with what that taxable value is to put onto the county's tax roll. That tax roll is delivered to my office every year on July 1st. And then the Auditor Controller Tax Accounting function calculates our tax rates. And we also add a variety of direct levies onto tax bills as well. These are typically items that have been approved either by the voters or approved through a property-based assessment process, wherein those are approved to be added onto your tax bill. After we calculate those tax rates and the direct levies, those then get sent to the Tax Collection Division of our office, who is responsible for billing and collecting those property taxes. And those bills are distributed each year to secured property tax owners in the October timeframe. Finally, after we collect all of those monies from taxpayers, those monies come back to the property tax accounting function of the Auditor Controller Division. And that unit will then apportion and distribute the taxes out to public agencies, making sure that the cities, special districts, and school districts receive those property taxes that are necessary to perform and sustain their public functions. Okay. Moving on, the other broad area that we perform services is through our three major collection divisions. Our Consolidated Utility Billing and Services Division provides billing and collection services for over 300,000 utility customers. The majority of these customer accounts are in the unincorporated areas of the county. However, we also provide services within the cities of Rancho Cordova and Citrus Heights. The services that we bill for include garbage services, water services, sewer, stormwater, and drainage. And through that program, we collect over $490 million each year that are then returned to those utility departments to provide those respective services. Our next large collection division is revenue recovery. Revenue recovery performs the collection of delinquent accounts and is typically referred debts from county departments that are over 90 days old or unpaid fines and fees from the Superior Court. In the past year, we collected approximately $25 million through the Revenue Recovery Program. And one feature of that program is when required by a court order, we also perform the collection for victims of crime to ensure that restitution is paid to them. In the last year, we returned over $4 million to victims of crime through this restitution program within that function. And then finally, as I talked through just a bit ago, our tax collector program collects the property taxes for the entire county, which is approximately $2.8 billion. And we also collect utility user taxes and transient occupancy taxes that are generated from hotel stays that occur within the unincorporated areas of the county. And then finally, the Department of Finance issues businesses licenses for the unincorporated areas of the county, with approximately 4,000 licenses being issued in the past year. So I know that was a mouthful, so we're going to head next to our first poll question. And so I wanted to ask you, what property tax function is not provided by the Department of Finance? Is that calculating the tax rate and adding direct levies, billing and collecting property taxes, valuing taxable property, or apportioning and distributing taxes to public agencies? And I'll give you just a minute to get your response in. All right, and it looks like we have most of you still with us and got it correct that the assessor's office, which is a separately elected department, is a department that performs the valuation of taxable property and then transmits that tax roll to us each year to then apply the rates and to get bills out to our taxpayers. So moving on, I wanted to share with you briefly, one of the key questions that we often get is, we write the property tax check out to the county, but where do our taxes go? Where do those dollars get distributed to? And this is summarizing across the entire county and all of the property taxes we collect, where they go. On the left, that you can see that the 7 cities in aggregate get 11% of the property taxes paid throughout the county. The county receives 16% of the property taxes that are paid from taxpayers in the county. And the largest share of property taxes here in the middle of this chart shows that 49%, almost half of the dollars that are paid, go to our various school districts to provide school-related programming. Finally, as we move over to the right, we have special districts that receive 17% of the property taxes. This includes fire districts, cemetery districts, water districts, the mosquito district, and a few other types of districts, such as reclamation districts, make up that 17%. And then finally, the slice furthest to the right is redevelopment agencies. Redevelopment agencies was a tool where cities or counties could form areas of the county that were determined to be blighted and in need of economic revival. In those situations, property taxes were steered as a means to finance those improvement projects. Redevelopment agencies existed up until 2011, when the state dissolved them. However, given that many redevelopment agencies use debt as a tool to finance these projects, we're still paying off a share of that debt over time, and they still receive 7% of the property taxes in the county. As those agencies continue to wind down in the future, that 7% will be returned back to cities, counties, school districts, and special districts for their programming. I'll transition to the next slide. I want to share briefly with you some of the things that we're working on to improve the finance department as we go into the next year. We are in the process of completing development and testing of a new property tax system that we plan to go live with in 2025. That has been a 3-year effort and almost a $50 million project to bring that system to fruition. And so as taxpayers, you'll see a bit different experience as you go to our website, as you interact in that system, when we get tax bills out in the summer of 2025. Next, we've implemented an additional tool, PaymentWorks, to try and make it easier to get vendors set up in our systems and to get electronic payments out to folks. We're trying to reduce over time our reliance on paper checks and to ensure that we can safely and securely get electronic payments out to as many of folks as possible. And then finally, we're engaged in a significant project with the Sacramento Area Sewer District, who is one of the large special districts that receive financial services from the county. They're in the process of separating their finances from us, and we're supporting their project to further strengthen them as an independent district of the county. On the next slide, this is your final poll question of the night. I want to ask you, which type of local government receives the most property taxes in Sacramento County? Is that the cities, the county, the school districts, or the special districts? I'll give it another minute for folks to get their answer. All right, well, it seems that we've got almost everybody got the correct answer. The school districts do receive 49% of the property taxes here in Sacramento County. And that was my last slide, so I want to check with Kim. Do we have any questions for finance?
No questions, Chad.
Okay, I'd like to turn it back over to Amanda Thomas for some concluding remarks.
Great. Thank you, Chad. I did want to end again with this slide, just letting folks know how you can get more involved in the county's budget process. Really also encourage everyone to go to our website, which is bdm.saccounty.gov, where you can find this presentation as well as a lot of the materials that I referenced in the presentation. And then at any time, you're welcome to email budget@saccounty.gov. It does not look like we have any additional Q&A at this point. So I did really want to thank Chris, Tim, and Chad, who have certainly helped make this presentation a lot more interesting and informative than it would have been if I were the only presenter. And I think really also helped to highlight the variety of services that the county provides. I also want to thank the folks behind the scenes that made all this possible tonight. And most importantly, I wanted to thank everybody who attended the webinar this evening. I hope that you found it informative. I really appreciate your interest in the county's budget and hope that we continue to hear from you. So with that, it looks like we do have one Q&A. Oh, just a thank you. Okay, so with that, I'll conclude this evening's webinar and thank you all again for your participation.